Victory lights flood London as the war finally ends. Crowds spill into streets still marked by bomb craters and boarded windows. Faces lifted toward a glow of celebration as if light itself proved survival. Flags wave from buildings that only weeks earlier shook under air raids. Music drifts through smoke-stained air. History remembers this moment as triumph. Britain endured. Britain stood firm. Britain won. But beneath the cheers, another story is already taking shape. One far quieter and far more dangerous. This story does not begin on a battlefield or in the sky above burning cities. It begins in rooms without windows, where ledgers sit open and numbers refuse to lie. Britain survived the war, yes, but it did so by spending something it could not easily replace. Not lives, not cities, but its future. For 6 years, Britain fought a total war with an empty wallet. Gold reserves vanished early. Overseas investments were sold off piece by piece. Trade routes that once fed the empire were cut by submarines and blockades. Before the war, Britain financed the world. During the war, Britain could barely finance itself. Yet the guns kept firing. Factories kept running. The population stayed fed, barely. That survival did not come from abundance. It came from credit. Ships arrived across dangerous seas loaded with food, fuel, aircraft, steel, and ammunition. Each shipment meant life. Each shipment also meant obligation. Think about that. Survival arrived not as a gift, but as a loan against tomorrow. The war forced Britain into a brutal calculation. Without supplies, the island would starve and fall. With supplies, the war could continue. There was no third option. Payment was postponed, not erased. Emergency agreements replaced normal trade. Promises replaced gold. Britain pledged assets, markets, and influence it could not afford to lose, all to buy time. On the surface, nothing seemed to change. The Union Jack still flew. Parliament still met. The empire still existed on maps painted red. But beneath that surface, leverage was shifting. Quietly, legally, permanently. This chapter opens with a contradiction history rarely confronts. Britain won the war militarily while losing the economic conditions that made empire possible. Victory concealed vulnerability. Survival masked dependence. And the price of staying alive during those desperate years would not be paid in 1945. It would be paid slowly, painfully over decades. When the cheering stopped and the lights dimmed, Britain would discover that winning a war on credit carries consequences no parade can erase. To understand how this happened, it is necessary to return to the moment when confidence still felt intact. In the early years of the war, Britain projected strength even as its foundations cracked. The public narrative was defiance. Factories expanded. Production surged. Ration books disciplined consumption. The population endured shortages with resolve. From the outside, Britain looked unbroken. From the inside, the arithmetic told a different story. Every week of war cost more than the previous one. Imports rose sharply as domestic production focused on weapons instead of food and fuel. Exports collapsed under the weight of convoy losses and industrial redirection. The balance that had sustained empire for generations was gone. Gold, once the anchor of British power, drained away at an alarming pace. Before the war, Britain held substantial reserves, and overseas investments that generated steady income were consumed them quickly. Food had to be purchased. Oil had to be imported. Aircraft and machinery demanded raw materials Britain no longer controlled freely. Payment could not be deferred forever. By the time the darkest years arrived, Britain was fighting with borrowed resources. This was not a temporary inconvenience. It was a structural transformation. Once reserves are spent, they do not magically return with peace. Yet none of this appeared in victory speeches. The story told to the public was simple and comforting. Britain stood alone, endured the storm, and emerged stronger for it. The reality was more complex. Britain stood, but it did not stand alone. It leaned. It leaned on vast flows of credit and supply that arrived from beyond its control. Those flows saved the nation. They also altered its position in the world. Think about that. When survival depends on someone else's capacity to supply, who truly holds power? The war created a financial imbalance that could not be undone by victory. Emergency measures taken under pressure hardened into long-term constraints. Britain agreed to conditions it would never have accepted in peacetime. Markets were opened. Preferences were weakened. Control over shipping and currency arrangements shifted. These were not dramatic moments captured by cameras. They were clauses in agreements, schedules and contracts, assumptions built into financial systems. They rarely make it into textbooks, but they decide futures. By 1945, Britain was exhausted. Cities lay damaged. Infrastructure strained. Industry worn thin. More importantly, the empire's financial engine was depleted. The resources that once allowed Britain to project power globally were gone. What remained was a nation alive, proud, and deeply constrained. Victory had preserved the state, but it had hollowed out the system that sustained empire. The cost of war was no longer measured in bombs or bodies alone. It was measured in dependency. This raises the central question of the story. If Britain survived the war by spending its future, when did the bill truly come due? Was it the moment reserves hit zero? Was it when emergency agreements locked in new rules? Or was it later, when Britain discovered it could no longer act freely on the global stage? History often treats victory as an ending. In this case, victory was a beginning, the beginning of repayment. Think about the nature of power for a moment. Power is not just armies and territory. It is choice. It is the ability to decide without asking permission. During the war, Britain lost much of that freedom in exchange for survival. That trade made sense in the moment. It saved lives. It kept the war going. But it also redefined Britain's position in the world. From creditor to debtor, from rule setter to rule taker, from empire at the center of global finance to nation navigating someone else's system. None of this diminishes the sacrifice or courage of those years. Survival was not optional. The alternative was catastrophe. But acknowledging necessity does not erase consequence. War finance has a memory. It records every concession. It preserves every obligation. Long after the smoke clears, the ledger remains. Britain would discover that the ledger was unforgiving. As the crowd celebrated in London, few understood this deeper truth. The light shone. The music played. Relief washed over a nation that had lived under threat for too long. Yet in vaults and offices, another atmosphere prevailed. Numbers were tallied. Obligations assessed. The scale of dependence became impossible to ignore. Britain had won the war, but it had lost the conditions that once made victory cheap. This chapter is not about betrayal or failure. It is about structure, about how modern wars are fought not just with weapons, but with balance sheets, about how survival can be financed, and how that financing reshapes power. The cheering crowds could not see it yet, but the empire's fate was already written into wartime agreements. The question was not whether Britain would pay the price. The question was how long it would take, and how much would be lost along the way. When the last victory lights dimmed, Britain stood at a crossroads it did not fully recognize. Alive, intact, and deeply indebted. The war was over. The accounting was just beginning. Before the war, Britain appeared untouchable. Its power did not rest only on soldiers or ships, but on a system that seemed almost invisible in its efficiency. Sea lanes stitched the globe together. Currencies flowed through London like blood through a heart. Contracts, insurance, and credit bound distant regions to the same financial center. The empire was not just territory painted red on maps. It was a machine that moved goods, money, and influence with practiced ease. From raw materials pulled from distant lands to finished products sold across continents, Britain sat at the center of exchange. Sterling was trusted. British banks were respected. The system had endured crises before. It felt permanent. London, more than any battlefield, symbolized its strength. It was a capital of paperwork as much as politics. Decisions made in quiet offices shaped railways in Asia, port in Africa, and trade in the Americas. Wealth flowed inward, was refined through finance and industry, and flowed outward again. This circulation sustained not only Britain's prosperity but its authority. Power followed money, and money followed London. On the eve of war, few believed this structure could truly fail. Britain had weathered global conflict before. It had adapted. It had won. Confidence was not arrogance. It was habit. When war came, that confidence did not vanish overnight. Instead, it hardened into resolve. Britain mobilized with speed and discipline. Factories retooled within weeks. Civilian production gave way to weapons, vehicles, and aircraft. Shipyards worked through the night. Cities learned to function in darkness under blackout rules. Ration books organized scarcity into order. The population adjusted. Sacrifice became routine. From the outside, this looked like proof of resilience. Britain was bending but not breaking. The empire, many believed, was showing why it had lasted so long. Women entered factories in vast numbers, filling roles once reserved for men. Production surged. Output climbed. Charts pointed upward. Politicians spoke of unity and endurance. Newspapers emphasized courage. The story was clear and reassuring. Britain was under strain, but it was coping. The system was working. Yet beneath this visible effort, another story unfolded, one harder to see and harder to admit. War consumed resources faster than any peacetime economy could replace them. Every gun fired represented metal that could not be reused. Every bomb dropped erased months of labor. Consumption was relentless. Production, no matter how heroic, could not keep pace. Imports became the lifeline. Britain could not feed itself. It could not fuel itself. Oil, food, and raw materials had to cross oceans under constant threat. The seas that once guaranteed Britain's dominance became battlegrounds. Ships disappeared faster than they could be replaced. Cargo that arrived safely was celebrated not as profit, but as survival. Each convoy mattered. Each loss tightened the margin. The empire's vast reach did not protect it from this reality. Distance increased vulnerability. Control of territory meant little when shipping lanes were contested. Exports, once the engine of British wealth, collapsed. Factories that had produced goods for global markets now focused on weapons that generated no revenue. Trade balances swung violently. Britain bought more than it sold, and the gap widened every month. This imbalance was not a minor accounting issue. It was a structural threat. For generations, Britain's power depended on exporting value and importing resources on favorable terms. War reversed that equation. Britain became a consumer without sufficient income. The difference had to be paid somehow. At first, Britain paid with gold. Reserves built over decades drained away rapidly. Gold crossed the Atlantic in guarded shipments, exchanged for food, fuel, and materials. Overseas investments were liquidated quietly. Assets that once produced steady income were sold to meet immediate needs. These measures bought time, but time was expensive. Each sale reduced future earning power. Each shipment of gold weakened the foundation of the system Britain relied upon. The public rarely saw this. The process was technical, abstract, and deliberately understated. But it mattered more than any speech. Confidence lingered because collapse did not come all at once. Britain still functioned. Government continued. Wages were paid. Supplies arrived. That continuity created the illusion of control. Imagine a great building with lights still on and doors still open, even as its internal supports are slowly removed. From the street, it looks solid. From within, stress accumulates. Britain's wartime economy operated under that illusion. Strength was visible. Weakness was hidden in ledgers few read. The empire itself added to this illusion. Colonies supplied manpower and materials. Contributions from across the empire reinforced the sense that Britain was not alone, that its reach still mattered. Yet even these resources could not offset the imbalance. Transport costs rose. Administrative burdens increased. Control became more expensive. The empire, once a source of net strength, began to strain under wartime pressure. Holding it together required resources Britain could barely spare. Despite this, morale held. The story of defiance worked. It needed to. Nations at war cannot function without belief. Britain believed in itself because it had to. The machinery of survival demanded cooperation and trust. Doubt would have been fatal. So the illusion of strength persisted, supported by necessity and habit. Leaders focused on winning the war first. Accounting could wait. Payment could wait. Survival came before solvency. Think about that choice. It was rational. It was unavoidable. But it carried consequences. War does not pause interest. It does not suspend arithmetic. It only delays reckoning. Britain delayed it for years, buying time with assets and promises. Each delay made the eventual cost higher. Each emergency measure narrowed future options. By the middle years of the war, the strain became harder to disguise. Reserves were dangerously low. Overseas income streams had been severed. The empire's financial arteries no longer fed the center as they once had. Britain's ability to act independently weakened with each passing month. Decisions increasingly depended on external supply and approval. The illusion of strength remained for public consumption, but policymakers understood the danger. Britain could not continue indefinitely on this path. Still, the system held together long enough to reach victory. That endurance reinforced a myth. It suggested that Britain's pre-war structure had proven itself once again. In reality, it had been fundamentally altered. The war transformed Britain from a self-financing power into a dependent one. The shift was gradual, almost invisible, but profound. By the time peace approached, the old model no longer existed. This illusion of strength mattered because it shaped expectations. Britons expected renewal after victory. They expected recovery, rebuilding, and a return to influence. The empire, many believed, would adapt and continue. Few understood that the economic engine required for that future had been dismantled during the war itself. The sacrifices made to survive left little room to maneuver afterward. Imagine standing on a ship that has survived a violent storm. The sails are torn. The hull is damaged. The cargo is gone. The crew celebrates survival. Yet the ship is far from port, and the means to continue the journey are gone. That was Britain's position as the war drew to a close. Alive, yes. Victorious, yes. Prepared for the future, no. This chapter reveals why Britain's wartime endurance was deceptive. The empire looked strong because it was still standing. But strength is not just survival. It is sustainability. War consumed Britain's capacity to sustain itself as a global power. The illusion carried the nation through its darkest hours. It also ensured that the cost of those hours would be paid later, when options were fewer and leverage was gone. The stage was set. Britain had endured. It had fought on, but the economic ground beneath it had shifted. What came next was not sudden collapse, but a slow realization. The empire that entered the war confident and wealthy would leave it constrained and exposed. The next chapter is where that realization becomes unavoidable, where dependence turns into leverage, and where the quiet mechanics of finance reshape the outcome of victory. The cracks did not arrive with explosions or invasions. They arrived quietly, in tables of figures and projected balances. Britain's survival rested on an economic mechanism rarely celebrated in victory stories. Dependence. By the middle of the war, reserves were exhausted. Gold was nearly gone. Overseas investments that once generated income had been sold off or pledged. The empire's financial cushion no longer existed. Britain faced a stark reality. It could not sustain the war on its own terms. To keep fighting, it had to accept help structured in ways that reshaped power beneath the alliance. Survival was no longer just a military effort. It was a negotiation. Emergency supply arrangements kept the nation alive. Ships continued to arrive with food, fuel, aircraft, and machinery. Factories stayed open. Cities did not starve. From a distance, the system appeared functional. But these arrangements were not neutral. They came with conditions that reached far beyond the war itself. Britain was no longer choosing freely how it traded, what it prioritized, or how it planned its future. Decisions were constrained by agreements signed under pressure. Each concession felt small in isolation. Together, they formed a web that narrowed Britain's freedom of action. Think about how power shifts in moments of desperation. When one side needs supplies immediately and the other controls access, leverage flows in one direction. Britain's bargaining position weakened with every passing month. The longer the war continued, the deeper the dependency became. Control over shipping schedules, currency arrangements, and post-war planning slowly slipped away. These were not dramatic takeovers. They were procedural changes, embedded in systems that would persist after peace. One of the most significant shifts occurred in currency relationships. Sterling, once a dominant force in global trade, emerged when the war weakened and constrained. Wartime arrangements limited its convertibility and reach. Markets that had once operated within Britain's financial orbit began to loosen their ties. This was not immediately visible to the public, but it mattered profoundly. Currency strength is not symbolic. It determines who sets terms and who accepts them. As sterling weakened, Britain's influence over global trade diminished with it. At the same time, Britain's overseas assets continued to disappear. Railways, utilities, and investments built over generations were sold or transferred to cover immediate needs. These assets were not luxuries. They were sources of long-term income and leverage. Selling them provided short-term relief at the cost of future stability. By the war's later years, Britain had sacrificed much of the financial infrastructure that once sustained empire. The process was irreversible. Once sold, control did not return. The turning point was not a single agreement or moment. It was a realization that crept in gradually. Britain could win battles and still lose control. Military success did not restore reserves. It did not rebuild income streams. Each victory extended the war effort, but deepened dependence. The arithmetic was relentless. The more Britain fought, the more it owed. The more it owed, the fewer choices it had. This was the paradox of wartime survival on credit. Ports remained busy, but the nature of what arrived had changed. Supplies now carried invisible strings. Delivery schedules influenced strategy. Availability shaped planning. Britain adapted, but adaptation came at a cost. Flexibility narrowed. Autonomy eroded. Decisions that once would have been purely domestic now required external consideration. That shift marked a fundamental change in Britain's position in the world. Power was no longer concentrated in London. It was shared unevenly and often reluctantly. Within government circles, awareness grew. Officials understood that victory would not restore the pre-war order. They saw the numbers. They understood the implications. But options were limited. Ending the war early was not acceptable. Fighting on without supplies was impossible. Britain remained trapped between necessity and consequence. The war had to be won first. The cost would be managed later. Or so it was hoped. This hope rested on a familiar assumption. That peace would bring recovery. That trade would resume. That the empire would generate revenue again. That debts could be serviced over time. What this assumption ignored was how deeply the wartime arrangements had altered the structure of global power. The system Britain would return to after victory was not the one it had left. Rules had changed. Markets had shifted. Influence had redistributed. By the final years of the war, Britain was economically hollowed out. Industry was exhausted. Infrastructure worn. The workforce strained. The empire's administrative costs outweighed its benefits in many regions. Yet the illusion of continuity persisted. Britain still had armies in the field. It still occupied territory. It still sat at negotiating tables as a great power. But behind the scenes, its leverage was diminished. Think about erosion rather than collapse. Erosion does not announce itself. It works slowly, removing strength grain by grain. Britain's wartime dependence eroded its foundations without dramatic rupture. There was no single moment when empire ended. There was only a steady loss of control, masked by the urgency of war. By the time peace arrived, much of the damage was already done. The balance of power had shifted without a single shot fired in anger. Financial structures, not armies, had redrawn influence. Britain's role changed from architect of the system to participant within it. This shift was not immediately acknowledged. Public narratives still spoke of victory, leadership, and partnership, but partnership between unequal parties is rarely equal in practice. As victory approached, Britain faced a sobering reality. It was intact but constrained, proud but dependent. The war had preserved the nation at the expense of its empire's financial core. What remained was a state capable of rebuilding domestically but limited internationally. The tools of dominance were gone. In their place stood obligations that would shape policy for decades. This was not collapse by defeat. It was erosion by obligation. Britain had survived by borrowing against its future, and now that future was arriving. The turning point had passed quietly during the war itself. Victory only revealed what dependents had already decided. The empire would not fall overnight. It would unwind slowly under the weight of debts and diminished leverage. The next chapter follows that unwinding. It traces what happens when wartime promises meet peacetime reality, when victory parades give way to ration books, and when an empire discovers that survival came at a price it can no longer afford. When the war ended, the reckoning began quietly. Factories that thundered through blacked-out nights slowed, then fell silent. Soldiers returned to cities still scarred and utilities stretched thin. Victory parades faded, but ration books did not. Food remained controlled. Fuel remained scarce. Clothing stayed limited. The public expected relief. Instead, austerity settled in like a second occupation, one without uniforms. Britain had survived the war, but it entered peace exhausted and constrained. The nation faced a world it could no longer command, only navigate. Debt framed every decision. Wartime obligations did not disappear with the guns. They matured. Servicing them demanded discipline and compromise. Currency weakness forced hard choices. Imports were necessary, but exports struggled to recover. The old model, exporting value, importing resources, and balancing the books through global trade, no longer functioned. Britain could not simply resume its place at the center of finance. The center had shifted. The system Britain returned to was not the one it had left. Rules were different. Influence had moved. And time was no longer on Britain's side. The empire felt this pressure first. Holding distant territories required money, administration, and force. All three were expensive. During the war, those costs had been justified by necessity. In peace, they became liabilities. Revenues from colonies failed to cover the price of control. Infrastructure demanded investment Britain could not spare. Political unrest grew, where promises of self-determination collided with economic reality. Each territory became a calculation. Was it worth the cost? Could Britain afford to stay? Increasingly, the answer was no. Retreat did not come as a single collapse. It came as a series of controlled withdrawals, negotiated exits, and reluctant concessions. The empire did not fall. It unwound. Maps changed color not through conquest, but through accounting. Debt constrained options. Currency weakness narrowed leverage. International commitments limited autonomy. Britain discovered that global leadership requires more than memory and prestige. It requires financial capacity. That capacity had been spent to survive. At home, rebuilding was urgent and uneven. Housing shortages were severe. Infrastructure needed repair. Industry required modernization. Social expectations had shifted after years of shared sacrifice. The state expanded to manage recovery and stability. These reforms were ambitious and necessary, but they came with costs. Funding them meant prioritizing domestic recovery over imperial ambition. Resources could not do both. The choice was not ideological. It was arithmetic. Think about the weight of that arithmetic. Every pound spent abroad was a pound unavailable at home. Every overseas commitment risked financial strain. Britain's leaders understood this. Even if the public narrative softened the truth, the empire had once financed the center. Now the center financed itself, carefully and painfully. Independence movements accelerated as the cost of control rose. The balance tipped decisively toward disengagement. Currency told the story most clearly. A strong currency signals confidence and reach. A weak one forces compromise. Britain's currency struggled under the combined weight of debt, trade imbalance, and lost income. Stabilization required cooperation and limits. Those limits shaped policy. They dictated what Britain could import, where it could invest, and how it could act abroad. Power followed liquidity. Liquidity was scarce. The global stage reflected this shift. Britain remained influential, but no longer dominant. Its voice carried weight, but not command. Decisions increasingly required alignment rather than assertion. This was not humiliation. It was adjustment. A recalibration forced by financial reality. The empire that had once set terms now operated within terms set by a system it no longer controlled. For many, this transition felt sudden. In truth, it had been building for years. Wartime finance had already decided the outcome. Peace merely revealed it. The secret price of survival was not paid in one moment. It was paid gradually, through constrained choices and diminished reach. Britain rebuilt itself as a nation, not an empire. That distinction mattered. Imagine winning everything you set out to protect, only to discover you no longer control it. That was the paradox of Britain's victory. The state endured. Society stabilized. But the architecture of imperial power was gone. Survival had been secured by borrowing against the future. The future arrived with conditions. This story matters beyond its time. It shows how modern power operates, not only through force, but through finance, not only through battles, but through balance sheets. Wars are not paid for when they are fought. They are paid for when peace arrives and obligations mature. Survival can be more expensive than defeat if it erodes the foundations of autonomy. The lesson is uncomfortable because it is current. Nations today face crises that demand immediate action. Supplies must arrive. Systems must be stabilized. Credit becomes lifeline. The choice feels unavoidable. Often it is, but the consequences are real. Emergency measures harden into structures. Dependencies become norms. And sovereignty narrows quietly, legally, and permanently. History remembers the cheers. It remembers the flags and the lights. It records courage and endurance. The ledgers remember something else. They remember what was promised, what was pledged, and what was lost. Britain's post-war world was shaped not by a single decision, but by years of necessary compromises. The empire did not collapse in defeat. It dissolved in repayment. Understanding this does not diminish sacrifice. It clarifies cost. It reveals a hidden weapon of modern conflict. Economics, debt, currency, and trade decide outcomes long after the fighting stops. Britain's experience stands as a warning and a guide. Survival secured through dependence reshapes power. Always, if this story changed how you see victory and power, subscribe to follow more deep-cut histories like this, and share this documentary with someone who still believes wars end when the guns fall silent.